organized attack built on spacing, movement, and collective execution, too much of the burden once again fell on the shoulders of one player. When a team repeatedly finds itself relying on a superstar to solve every problem, it raises legitimate questions about the effectiveness of the system surrounding that player. What made Clark's performance especially impressive was not simply the production itself, but the pressure under which it was produced. Every possession carried heightened expectations. Every mistake was magnified. Every successful play seemed to require a level of creativity and shot-making that few players in the league are capable of delivering consistently. That is why the conversation cannot stop at celebrating the result. Indiana won, and Clark was exceptional, but sustainable success requires more than heroic performances. Championship-level teams create environments where their best players can thrive without being forced to carry an overwhelming share of the responsibility every night. The reality is that Clark's performance against Chicago looked less like a player operating within a perfectly functioning system and more like a superstar compensating for issues that should have been solved collectively. Her talent covered cracks that became visible throughout the game, and while that is a testament to her greatness, it is also a warning sign for the future. The most important takeaway from this matchup is not that Caitlin Clark was spectacular. By now, spectacular has become expected. The more important question is why Indiana continues to place itself in situations where spectacular is required. A franchise with championship aspirations cannot build its future around the assumption that one player will repeatedly deliver extraordinary solutions to ordinary problems. Against Chicago, Clark once again proved she is capable of doing exactly that. The concern is that she had to.
Commissioner's Cup game, the Fever are in defense of their championship from a year ago. They likely need to win tonight to keep those chances alive. That pass deflected way outside for Clark, who drops a three.
Makes it look so easy.
And as Timpson comes up with the block on Stevens. She's coming off a great defensive performance in Washington, but she held Citron well below her season averages. Clark spins, fades, fires, and hits.
There are really two separate conversations that need to happen after this game, and combining them into a single narrative risks missing what actually took place on the court. One conversation is about Caitlin Clark's brilliance. The other is about why such brilliance was required in the first place. Let's begin with the performance itself. Clark finished with 32 points, 10 assists, and 7 rebounds while converting all 13 of her free throw attempts. She shot efficiently, controlled the pace of the game, and consistently delivered when Indiana needed a play. Alongside Aaliyah Boston, who contributed 34 points and 12 rebounds, the duo accomplished something unprecedented. For the first time in WNBA history, two teammates recorded 30-point double-doubles in the same game. That achievement deserves recognition not simply as a statistical curiosity, but as a historic milestone that will remain part of the league's record books. What makes Clark's night even more impressive is the way she generated those points. The 13-4-13 performance from the free throw line wasn't accidental. It reflected a player attacking aggressively, forcing defenders into difficult positions, initiating contact, and placing constant pressure on the defense. When Clark plays downhill, gets into the paint, and dictates the action, Indiana's offense reaches a completely different level. Throughout the season, one of the most debated questions surrounding the Fever has been why that version of Clark doesn't appear consistently. The contrast between games where she barely reaches the free throw line and games where she repeatedly attacks the rim tells an important story. When she is empowered to be the primary creator, the offense becomes more dynamic, more difficult to defend, and significantly more productive. Yet despite all of that success, Indiana still found itself fighting for a result that should have been secured much earlier. That is where the second conversation begins. The Fever built a substantial advantage and appeared to have complete control of the game. At one point, a comfortable victory seemed inevitable. Instead, the contest became unnecessarily competitive, eventually requiring overtime despite the significant talent advantage Indiana possessed on the floor. Critics of the coaching staff will point directly to this outcome as another example of a recurring issue. Their argument is not that the Fever lack talent. In fact, nights like this demonstrate the exact opposite. Their concern is that the team's execution in critical moments often fails to match the level of talent available. One late-game sequence perfectly illustrates the frustration. Holding a lead in the final minute with possession of the basketball, Indiana had an opportunity to manage the clock, reduce Chicago's chances, and effectively close out the game. Instead, An early contested shot gave Chicago another opportunity to regain possession and build momentum. Small decisions like that can dramatically alter the closing moments of a game, and in this case they helped open the door for a comeback that should never have been possible. Aliyah Boston's performance deserves equal praise in this discussion. Her 34 points and 12 rebounds were not the product of volume alone. She was efficient, physical, and consistently effective throughout the night. More importantly, her chemistry with Clark continues to highlight what may be Indiana's most dangerous offensive weapon. When Boston sets quality screens, rolls decisively, creates passing angles, and works in tandem with Clark's playmaking, the Fever become extremely difficult to defend. The Clark-Boston partnership combines elite perimeter creation with dominant interior production, forcing defenses into impossible choices. The historic numbers produced by both players are evidence of just how effective that partnership can be when fully utilized. And that is exactly why the larger questions remain. A historic performance from Clark. A historic performance from Boston. A record-breaking achievement for both players. Yet despite all of that, Indiana still found itself struggling to finish a game against a Chicago team that entered the night below 500. That contradiction is impossible to ignore. The biggest takeaway from this game is not merely that Clark and Boston were extraordinary. Everyone already knows they are capable of extraordinary performances. The more important takeaway is that when two players produce one of the most historic statistical nights in league history, the game should not still be hanging in the balance during the closing moments. That is the part of the story that demands just as much attention as the box score itself. The reason this game continues to generate debate is not simply because Indiana won. It is because the path to that victory raised questions that should not exist given the circumstances. The Chicago Sky entered the matchup with a losing record and, on paper, appeared overmatched by an Indiana roster featuring two players capable of producing historic performances on the same night. When a team receives 32 points, 10 assists, and 7 rebounds from Caitlin Clark while also getting 34 points and 12 rebounds from Aliyah Boston, the expectation is not a dramatic overtime finish. The expectation is control. Instead, a sizable advantage slowly disappeared. Much of the post-game discussion has centered on the specific decisions that contributed to that collapse. One of the most heavily scrutinized moments came in the final minute when Indiana held possession while protecting a multiple possession lead. In situations like that, clock management becomes just as important as shot making. The priority is usually to reduce possessions, force the opponent to foul, and make every remaining second work in your favor. Indiana instead took a quick contested shot that failed to convert, giving Chicago additional time and opportunity. While no single possession determines an entire game, moments like that can dramatically shift momentum, particularly when an opponent is desperately searching for a way back into the contest. Another sequence that attracted attention occurred during a crucial inbound possession. Clark had spent the entire evening relentlessly attacking the defense and converting every free throw opportunity she received. Many observers naturally questioned whether the ball should have been placed in the hands of the player who had been nearly automatic under pressure throughout the game. The possession unfolded differently, leading to a turnover that extended Chicago's chances and helped keep the game alive. Those moments were significant because they transformed what should have been routine closing possessions into opportunities for the Sky to continue their comeback. The defensive side of the equation created additional concerns. One of the biggest surprises of the game came from Chicago's bench production. A reserve player caught fire offensively and delivered a scoring burst that dramatically changed the flow of the contest. During a critical stretch, Indiana struggled to contain the hot hand, allowing momentum to swing rapidly toward Chicago. Critics of the coaching staff have pointed to that sequence as an example of delayed in-game adjustments. They argue that defensive assignments and personnel choices failed to adapt quickly enough to stop the scoring run before it became a major factor in the game. Once different matchups were introduced, the offensive surge slowed considerably, raising questions about whether those adjustments could have arrived sooner. The discussion surrounding Lexi Hull has resurfaced because of those defensive possessions. Throughout the season, many analysts and fans have viewed Hull as one of Indiana's most reliable perimeter defenders. As a result, every game that features defensive breakdowns inevitably leads to renewed debate about her role, minutes, and usage within the rotation. Whether those criticisms are entirely fair is open to interpretation, but the conversation continues because the evidence on the floor often fuels it. When a defensive problem appears to improve after a personnel adjustment, observers naturally wonder why that adjustment was not made earlier. Meanwhile, Chicago's comeback was not primarily driven by overwhelming dominance in the paint or by a single unstoppable frontcourt presence. Instead, much of the damage came from perimeter scoring, defensive lapses, and momentum swings that Indiana struggled to control despite holding a substantial advantage for large portions of the game. That is ultimately why this game remains such an interesting case study. The story is not that Indiana lacked talent. The story is that Indiana possessed more than enough talent to avoid the situation altogether. Clark was spectacular. Boston was dominant. Together they delivered one of the most historic statistical performances the league has ever seen from a pair of teammates. Yet despite all of that, the game still reached overtime. For many observers, that reality shifts the conversation away from player performance and toward execution, adjustments, game management, and decision-making. When two stars produce at a historic level and victory still becomes a struggle, the natural question is no longer about whether the players did enough. The question becomes why they had to do so much in the first place. In the end, Indiana escaped with the victory, but the final result does not erase the questions raised by the path that led there. The overtime win will be recorded in the standings, and the historic performances from Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston will be remembered long after the details of the game fade. However, the circumstances that made overtime necessary remain part of the story as well. For many observers, this game felt like another example of a season-long trend. Time and again, Indiana's most talented players have delivered exceptional performances, only for those performances to be required because of mistakes, breakdowns, or strategic decisions that create unnecessary pressure late in games. Whether that criticism is entirely fair or not, it has become one of the defining narratives surrounding the team. The Clark-Boston partnership continues to provide the strongest evidence of what Indiana can become at its best. When Boston sets effective screens, rolls decisively to the basket, and creates pressure on the interior while Clark controls the action from the perimeter, opposing defenses are placed in nearly impossible situations. Defenders must choose between containing Clark's shooting and playmaking ability or dealing with Boston's strength and efficiency near the rim. More often than not, there is no perfect answer. That offensive partnership was on full display throughout stretches of this game. The results speak for themselves. Historic numbers were produced, records were set, and the Fever offense looked capable of overwhelming virtually any opponent. Those sequences represented the highest ceiling of this roster and demonstrated why so many analysts believe the Clark-Boston connection should remain at the center of Indiana's offensive identity moving forward. The frustration expressed by critics stems from the belief that those highly effective actions are not always featured as consistently as they could be. Instead, they argue that the offense occasionally drifts away from its most efficient options, leading to possessions that depend more heavily on individual shot creation and less on the collective advantages created by the Clark-Boston partnership. Similarly, late-game execution continues to generate scrutiny. Closing out games requires discipline, decision-making, and an understanding of situational basketball. Small mistakes become magnified when protecting leads, and several key possessions against Chicago allowed a comeback opportunity that appeared unlikely only minutes earlier. Those moments have fueled ongoing discussions about game management, player decision-making, and coaching adjustments. Defensively, Indiana also faced challenges that contributed to the collapse of its once comfortable lead. Chicago found offensive rhythm during critical stretches, and questions emerged regarding matchups, rotations, and the timing of adjustments. While no team executes perfectly for 40 minutes, critics argue that some of the issues that surfaced were both predictable and preventable. One statistic in particular stands out when evaluating Clark's performance. Her perfect 13-4-13 night from the free throw line reflected a level of aggression and offensive control that transformed the game. Rather than settling for difficult perimeter shots, she consistently pressured the defense, attacked gaps, forced contact, and created scoring opportunities. That style of play not only generated points for herself, but also opened opportunities for teammates throughout the game. For many analysts, that aggressive version of Clark represents the blueprint for Indiana's offense. When she is empowered to attack, create, and dictate the pace, the entire team benefits. The difference between games where she frequently reaches the free throw line and games where she rarely gets there often mirrors the difference between Indiana's most efficient offensive performances and its most frustrating ones. Ultimately, this game tells two stories simultaneously. The first is a positive one. Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston delivered one of the greatest statistical